The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the small town of Wichita Falls as young Greg Abbott laced up his running shoes on that fateful July morning in 1984. At 26, he was the picture of ambition and determination, a young lawyer with dreams as big as the state. He called home. "You're gonna run yourself into the ground in this heat, son," called out Mrs. Henderson from her porch, fanning herself with a church bulletin. The temperature was already climbing toward triple digits, but Greg just flashed that confident smile that would one day win over millions of Texans. "Yes, Mum, but that's what makes us tough down here," he replied, adjusting his cap. "My daddy always said, if you can't handle the Texas heat, you got no business being a Texan." Greg's roots ran deep in Texas soil. His father, Calvin Abbott, had instilled in him the values that would define his entire life: hard work, personal responsibility, and an unwavering belief in the Constitution. Growing up in a modest household, Greg learned early that nothing worth having came easy. Politics ain't about making friends, Calvin would tell his son over dinner at their kitchen table. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the whole world's telling you you're wrong. As Greg stretched against an old oak tree, he thought about his law practice and his growing interest in public service. He'd been watching the political landscape in Texas, seeing opportunities to make a real difference. The state was changing, but Greg believed in preserving the values that made Texas special. "The thing about Texas," he'd often say to his colleagues, "is that we've always been independent. We joined the Union by choice, and we've never forgotten that we're Texans first." The morning was perfect for his usual 5-mile route through the neighborhood. The tree-lined streets of this quiet residential area provided some shade, and Greg found his rhythm quickly. This was his thinking time, when he'd plan his day, consider his cases, and dream about the future. Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below, and leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. He had no idea that in just a few minutes, his life would change forever, and that this moment of adversity would become the foundation of an incredible story of resilience that would inspire millions. The crack of the massive oak branch echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a gunshot. One moment, Greg Abbott was running strong, his mind focused on the day ahead. The next, he was lying beneath several hundred pounds of wood. His world turned upside down in an instant. "Oh my Lord, somebody help." Mrs. Henderson's voice pierced the morning air as she ran toward the scene, her church bulletin forgotten on the porch. Greg's first thought wasn't about pain. It was about the strange silence that had settled over his body. From his waist down, he felt nothing. The realization hit him like a second falling tree. "Don't move me," he managed to say as neighbors gathered around. His legal training kicked in even in crisis. "Call 911. And don't let anyone move me until the paramedics get here." Tom Rodriguez, a neighbor who'd become a good friend, knelt beside him. "Greg, you're gonna be okay, buddy. Just hang in there." "Tom," Greg said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "I need you to call my office. Tell them I won't be in today." Even in the worst moment of his life, Greg Abbott was thinking about his responsibilities. The ambulance seemed to take forever, but in reality, it was there in minutes. As the paramedics worked to stabilize him, Greg kept his mind sharp, asking questions, understanding his situation. He was a lawyer. He needed facts, even when those facts were about his own body. "Son, you've got some serious spinal damage," the lead paramedic, a weathered man named Chuck, told him honestly. "We're gonna take real good care of you, but I won't lie, this is serious." "I appreciate the straight talk," Greg replied. "That's how we do things in Texas." During the ambulance ride to the hospital, Greg's mind raced. He thought about his career, his dreams, his future. But instead of despair, something else began to grow inside him, a fierce determination that would define the rest of his life. "You know what, Chuck," he said to the paramedic, "this might be the end of one chapter, but it's not the end of my story, not by a long shot." Chuck had seen a lot of trauma victims in his career, but he'd never seen anyone face such devastating news with such resolve. "You got some fight in you, son. That's good. You're gonna need it." As they pulled into the hospital, Greg Abbott was already beginning to transform his greatest challenge into his greatest strength. The fall had taken his legs, but it had also revealed something unbreakable in his spirit, something that would carry him all the way to the governor's mansion. 6 months later, Greg Abbott sat in his hospital room, legal briefs scattered across his bed table. His doctor, Sarah Martinez, shook her head as she reviewed his chart. "Greg, you're supposed to be focusing on recovery, not working 12-hour days from a hospital bed," she said, her voice mixing concern with admiration. "Dr. Martinez, with all due respect, the law doesn't stop just because I got knocked down," Greg replied, not looking up from his papers. "Besides, my clients are counting on me." What Dr. Martinez didn't fully understand was that work wasn't just Greg's profession. It was his lifeline. Every brief he wrote, every case he argued from his hospital bed, was proof that Greg Abbott was still fighting, still contributing, still the same man he'd always been. His law partner, Jim Collins, visited every day, bringing cases and updates. From the office, "Greg, the settlement offer from the tree company came in," Jim said, sliding a document across the bed table. Greg glanced at the number and pushed it back. "Not interested. It's a substantial amount, Greg. Life-changing money, Jim." "I didn't get into law to cash in on my misfortune," Greg said firmly. "I got into law to serve justice. That tree company's insurance should make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. But I'm not looking for a payday." This decision would become legendary in Texas legal circles. The lawyer who could have become wealthy from his accident, but chose principle over profit. It was classic Greg Abbott, always thinking about the bigger picture, always considering how his actions would affect others. The real turning point came when his physical therapist, a tough-as-nails woman named Rosa Gutierrez, wheeled him to the hospital's law library. "You keep saying you want to get back to work," Rosa said. "Well, here's work. But first, you gotta learn to navigate this world in a different way." Greg spent the next hour maneuvering his wheelchair between the stacks, reaching for books, learning to adapt. It was frustrating, exhausting, and humbling, but it was also empowering. "You know what, Rosa," he said as they headed back to his room, "I'm not disabled. I'm just differently abled, and I'm gonna show Texas what that means." Rosa smiled. In 30 years of therapy, she'd seen many patients accept their limitations. Greg Abbott was the first she'd seen decide to transcend them. Within weeks, Greg was back in court, arguing cases with the same passion and skill he'd always shown. Judges, juries, and fellow attorneys quickly learned that the wheelchair didn't slow down Greg Abbott. If anything, it seemed to sharpen his focus and strengthen his resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he would say, rolling his chair confidently before the jury box, "justice doesn't depend on whether you can walk. It depends on whether you can stand up for what's right." The accident that could have ended Greg Abbott's career instead became the foundation of his greatest achievements. He was learning that true strength isn't about what happens to you. It's about what you do with what happens to you. The year was 1992, and Greg Abbott was sitting in his law office when the phone call came that would change everything. On the other end was Governor George W. Bush himself. "Greg, I've been watching your work, and I've got a proposition for you," Bush said in his familiar Texas drawl. "How'd you like to serve on the Texas Supreme Court?" Greg leaned back in his chair, momentarily speechless. At 34, he'd built a reputation as one of the most tenacious lawyers in the state. But a judgeship, that was the kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime. "Governor, I'm honored you'd consider me," Greg replied. "But I have to ask, you sure you want a judge who needs a wheelchair to get to the bench?" Bush chuckled. "Greg, I'm not appointing your wheelchair. I'm appointing you. From what I've seen, that chair hasn't slowed you down one bit. In fact, it might have made you stronger." That evening, Greg sat on his back porch with his wife, Cecilia, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and red. They'd been married for just a few years, but she'd already proven to be his strongest supporter and wisest counselor. "What's got you thinking so hard?" Cecilia asked, settling into the chair beside him. "The governorship called today," Greg said simply. "Supreme Court appointment." Cecilia's eyes lit up. "Greg, that's incredible. You've always said you wanted to serve the people of Texas in a bigger way, I know, but..." Greg paused, wrestling with doubts that had nothing to do with his capabilities and everything to do with public perception. What if folks think I can't handle it? What if they see the chair instead of the man? Cecilia reached over and took his hand. "Honey, you've been proving people wrong your whole life. Remember what you told me when we first met? You said, 'I don't let anything stop me from doing what I believe is right.'" Greg smiled, remembering that conversation. They'd met at a legal conference, and he'd been immediately drawn to her sharp mind and warm heart. When he'd asked her to dinner, she'd said yes without hesitation. Seeing the man before the wheelchair. "You know what convinced me about you," Cecilia continued. "It wasn't your legal skills. Though they're impressive, it was watching you fight for that family in the wrongful death case. You could have settled for easy money, but you took it to trial because it was the right thing to do." The next morning, Greg called Governor Bush back. "Governor, I accept your appointment, but I want you to know, I'm going to be the kind of judge who follows the Constitution, not popular opinion." "Greg, that's exactly why I picked you," Bush replied. "Texas needs judges who aren't afraid to make tough decisions based on the law, not on politics." Greg's confirmation hearing was unlike anything the Texas Senate had seen. Rolling his chair up to the witness table, he faced a room full of senators, some skeptical, others curious, all watching to see how this new kind of judge would present himself. "Senators," he began, his voice clear and confident, "I know some of you might wonder if I can handle the demands of serving on our state's highest court. Let me tell you what I've learned in the years since my accident. Strength isn't about what you can lift or how fast you can run. It's about your commitment to justice, your dedication to the Constitution, and your willingness to make hard decisions when they need to be made." Senator Martinez, a tough questioner known for his rigorous confirmations, leaned forward. "Judge Abbott, how do we know you can handle the physical demands of this position?" Greg smiled. "Senator, I've been handling the physical demands of practicing law for 8 years since my accident. I've argued cases in every major courthouse in Texas. The only thing that's changed is that now I'll be making decisions instead of just arguing for them." The confirmation vote was unanimous. As Greg was sworn in as the youngest member of the Texas Supreme Court, he looked out at the packed courtroom and saw faces filled with hope. Hope that their new judge would bring something different to the bench. In his first major case, involving property rights and eminent domain, Greg wrote an opinion that would become a landmark in Texas jurisprudence. The case had national implications, and legal scholars across the country took notice of the clear, principled reasoning of Texas's newest Supreme Court justice. "The Constitution isn't a suggestion," Greg wrote in his opinion. "It's the foundation of our democracy, and it's my job to protect it, even when, especially when, it's unpopular to do so." By 1998, Justice Abbott had established himself as one of the most respected voices on the Texas Supreme Court. His opinions were quoted in law schools across the nation, and his commitment to constitutional principles had earned him admirers from both sides of the political aisle. But Greg was restless. Sitting in his chambers after a long day of oral arguments, he found himself thinking about the bigger picture. Texas was changing, and he wanted to be part of shaping that change. "You've got that look again," said his clerk, Maria Santos, as she brought in a stack of cases for review. Maria had been with Greg for 3 years, and she'd learned to read his moods. "What look is that?" Greg asked, spinning his chair around to face her. "The look that says you're thinking about something bigger than just these cases," Maria replied with a knowing smile. "You get it every time you read about some federal overreach or constitutional violation that's happening outside our courtroom." Greg chuckled. Maria knew him too well. "You know, Maria, I've been thinking about running for Attorney General when the position opens up." Maria's eyes widened. "That's a big jump from the Supreme Court, Justice Abbott, is it?" Though Greg asked, "Think about it. As Attorney General, I could defend Texas against federal overreach. I could protect our state's rights, our Second Amendment freedoms, our religious liberty. I could be Texas's lawyer in the biggest fights of our time. That weekend, Greg drove out to his parents' ranch in West Texas. The wide open spaces had always helped him think clearly, and he needed clarity now more than ever. His father, Calvin, was waiting on the porch when Greg arrived. At 78, Calvin Abbott was still sharp as a tack and twice as stubborn. "So, I hear you're thinking about running for Attorney General," Calvin said without preamble. "Word travels fast," Greg replied, maneuvering his chair up the ramp Calvin had built years ago. "It does when you're talking about my son making a decision that could affect the whole state of Texas," Calvin said. "Question is, why do you want to do it?" Greg looked out over the ranch land, watching cattle graze in the distance. "Dad, remember what you used to tell me about standing up for what's right, even when the whole world's telling you you're wrong." Calvin nodded. Double quotes. "Well, I think Texas needs someone who's willing to do that on a statewide level. Someone who'll fight for our Constitution, our freedoms, and our way of life." Calvin was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Son, I've been waiting 30 years for you to find your real calling. Sounds like you just did." The 2002 Attorney General race was unlike anything Texas had seen. Greg's opponent, a well-funded Democrat with name recognition and establishment support, had expected an easy victory. What he got instead was a masterclass in grassroots campaigning and principled politics. Greg's campaign headquarters was a converted warehouse in Austin, buzzing with volunteers from across the state. His campaign manager, Steve Walsh, had worked on campaigns for 20 years, but he'd never seen anything like the energy surrounding Greg Abbott. "We've got volunteers driving in from El Paso, from Amarillo, from Houston," Steve reported during a strategy meeting. "They're not coming because we're paying them or because they owe us favors. They're coming because they believe in what Greg stands for." The defining moment of the campaign came during a debate at the University of Texas. Greg's opponent, trying to score political points, made a comment about Greg's wheelchair, suggesting that voters might question whether he could handle the physical demands of the job. The auditorium fell silent. Then Greg Abbott smiled, that same confident smile he'd shown Mrs. Henderson all those years ago, when she'd warned him about running in the heat. "You know," Greg said, leaning forward slightly, "I've been hearing that question for 18 years now, and for 18 years, I've been proving that determination matters more than mobility. I've served on the Texas Supreme Court. I've argued cases in every major courthouse in this state, and I've never once let my wheelchair stop me from doing what's right for Texas." The applause was thunderous, but Greg wasn't finished. "The question isn't whether I can handle this job physically," he continued. "The question is whether I'll have the backbone to stand up to federal overreach, to defend our Constitution, and to fight for the values that make Texas special. And I can promise you this, my backbone is just fine." On election night, Greg won by the largest margin in Texas Attorney General history. As he addressed his victory celebration, surrounded by supporters from every corner of the state, he made a promise that would define his tenure. "Tonight, Texas has chosen a fighter," he said. "Someone who'll stand up to anyone, federal bureaucrats, special interests, or political pressure when they try to take away our freedoms. I'm going to be Texas's lawyer, and I'm going to win." Attorney General Greg Abbott's first day in office started at 5 a.m., just as it had every day for the past 20 years. But this morning was different. This morning, he was officially Texas's top lawyer, and he had a state to defend. His first staff meeting was held in the conference room of the Attorney General's office, a room that had seen countless legal battles and political compromises. But the tone Greg set was different from his predecessors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the assembled lawyers, investigators, and staff members, "we're not here to play politics. We're here to defend the Constitution and protect the rights of 25 million Texans. Every case we take, every decision we make, has to pass one simple test. Is it right?" His deputy, Jennifer Rodriguez, a brilliant lawyer who'd worked in the office for 15 years, raised her hand. "General Abbott, what's our priority? Where do we start?" Greg smiled. "Jennifer, we start with the cases that matter most to regular Texans. Property rights, religious freedom, the right to bear arms, protection from federal overreach. These aren't abstract legal concepts. They're about real people living real lives. Within his first month, Greg had already made national headlines. The federal government had issued new regulations that would have severely impacted Texas landowners, and Greg filed suit immediately. The federal government seems to think they can tell Texans how to use their own land. Greg told reporters on the steps of the federal courthouse, "Well, they're about to learn that Texas doesn't back down from a fight, especially when it comes to our property rights." The case, which legal experts predicted would take years to resolve, was decided in Texas's favor within 6 months. It was the first of what would become dozens of victories against federal overreach. But it was a smaller case that truly showed Greg's character. Maria Gonzalez, a single mother from Laredo, had been fighting a utility company that was trying to use eminent domain to take her family's land for a private development project. She'd contacted the Attorney General's office as a last resort, never expecting to hear back. Greg not only took her case personally, but drove to Laredo to meet with her family. "Mr. Attorney General," Maria said, clearly nervous as she welcomed him into her modest home, "I can't believe you came all this way." "Mrs. Gonzalez," Greg replied, "this is exactly why I ran for this office. When big corporations try to take advantage of hardworking families, it's my job to level the playing field." The case went to trial, and Greg himself argued it. The sight of the Texas Attorney General in a wheelchair, passionately defending a single mother's property rights against a major corporation, made front-page news across the state. "Your Honor," Greg argued, "this case is about more than just one family's land. It's about whether we're going to allow the powerful to take from the powerless, simply because they can. In Texas, we believe in protecting the little guy, and that's exactly what we're going to do." The jury ruled unanimously in favor of the Gonzalez family. As Greg shook hands with Maria outside the courthouse, she had tears in her eyes. "You didn't just save my land," she told him. "You gave me hope that there are still people in government who care about families like mine." Stories like this spread across Texas like wildfire. Here was an attorney general who didn't just talk about defending people's rights, he actually did it. His approval ratings soared, but more importantly, his office was flooded with calls from ordinary Texans who finally felt like they had someone fighting for them. Greg's success in defending Texas against federal overreach was becoming legendary. In case after case, he outmaneuvered federal bureaucrats and won victories that protected Texas's sovereignty. Legal scholars began calling him the most effective state attorney general in the country. But perhaps his greatest victory came in a case involving religious freedom. A federal court had ruled that a small Texas town couldn't display a cross on public property, even though it had been there for 50 years and was part of a historical memorial. Greg took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing personally before the 9 justices. "Justices," he said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction, "this case is about whether we're going to allow political correctness to erase our history and our heritage. That cross isn't just a religious symbol. It's a memorial to the brave men and women who gave their lives for our freedom. Texas won't stand by and watch our history be erased." The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in favor of Texas. It was Greg's biggest victory yet, and it established him as the nation's leading defender of religious liberty. As he celebrated with his staff that night, Greg reflected on how far he'd come. From that hospital bed where he'd refused to let his accident define him, to the Supreme Court where he'd just won a case that would protect religious freedom for generations to come. "You know what the best part is?" he told Jennifer Rodriguez as they watched the news coverage of their victory. "We're not just winning cases. We're showing people that principled leadership still exists, that someone is still willing to fight for what's right." By the end of his first term as Attorney General, Greg Abbott had argued and won more cases before the U.S. Supreme Court than any other state attorney general in history. He'd become a national figure, a symbol of effective conservative governance and principled leadership. But his greatest achievement wasn't measured in court victories or headlines. It was measured in the restored faith of millions of Texans who believed that their government was finally fighting for them. The year 2013 brought whispers across Texas that would soon become a roar. After 12 successful years as Attorney General, Greg Abbott was ready for his next challenge. The governor's race was calling, and Texas was ready for his brand of principled leadership. Greg sat in his Austin office, looking out at the Capitol Dome, when his longtime advisor, Dave Carney, knocked on the door. "Governor Rick Perry just announced he's not running for re-election," Dave said, settling into the chair across from Greg's desk. "The field's wide open, and every political consultant in Texas is asking the same question: is Greg Abbott going to run?" Greg had been thinking about this moment for months. As Attorney General, he'd won 54 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, more than any other state attorney general in American history. He'd fought the federal government and won time and again, but governing a state of 28 million people, that was a whole different challenge. "Dave, I've spent my career fighting for Texas in the courtroom," Greg said thoughtfully. "But I keep thinking about all the battles we can't win with lawsuits, education, the economy, border security. These need executive leadership, not just legal arguments." That evening, Greg drove home to his house in Westlake Hills. Cecilia was waiting for him on the back porch, as she had been for 20 years of marriage. Their daughter, Audrey, was away at college, but the family's golden retriever, Pancake, was lounging at Cecilia's feet. "So," Cecilia said without looking up from her book, "are we going to talk about the elephant in the room?" Greg smiled. After 2 decades of marriage, Cecilia could read him like an open book. "The governor's race," he said simply. "The governor's race," she confirmed. "What's your heart telling you?" Greg was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set over the Texas Hill Country. "My heart's telling me that Texas needs someone who won't compromise on principles, who'll stand up to Washington when they overreach, and who'll fight for the values that make this state special." "And your head?" "My head's telling me it's going to be the fight of my life." Cecilia closed her book and looked at her husband. "Greg, you've been preparing for this fight your whole career. From that hospital bed 30 years ago to the Supreme Court victories, everything has been leading to this moment." The announcement came on a scorching July day in 2013. Standing before a crowd of supporters at a rally in San Antonio, Greg Abbott officially declared his candidacy for governor of Texas. "My fellow Texans," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "For 12 years, I've been Texas's lawyer, fighting for our state against federal overreach and defending our constitutional rights. Now, I'm ready to be Texas's governor, to lead our state into an even brighter future." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Greg wasn't finished. "Some folks might wonder if a guy in a wheelchair can handle being governor. Well, I've been handling challenges my whole life, and I've never let anything stop me from fighting for what's right. I may be in a wheelchair, but there's nothing wrong with my backbone." The campaign that followed was unlike anything Texas had seen. Greg's opponent in the Republican primary was a well-funded establishment candidate. But Greg had something more powerful than money. He had a record of results and the trust of Texas voters. At a town hall in Amarillo, rancher Bill Thompson stood up to ask a question. "General Abbott, how do we know you'll fight for rural Texas? A lot of politicians forget about us once they get to Austin." Greg's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Bill, I grew up understanding that Texas isn't just our big cities. It's our small towns, our ranches, our farming communities. As Attorney General, I've fought to protect property rights, water rights, and the Texas way of life. As governor, I'll make sure rural Texas has a voice in the governor's mansion." The primary wasn't even close. Greg won with over 90% of the vote, a landslide that sent shockwaves through the political establishment. But the real test came in the general election. His Democratic opponent, Wendy Davis, was a formidable candidate who'd gained national attention for her filibuster in the Texas Senate. The race drew national media attention and millions of dollars in outside spending. The defining moment came during their first debate at the University of Texas. Wendy Davis, trying to score political points, criticized Greg's record on education. "Funding. Texans deserve a governor who'll fight for our children's education," she said, "not someone who's spent his career fighting against public schools." Greg's response was swift and powerful. Senator Davis, I've spent my career fighting for Texas families and their right to choose the best education for their children. I've defended homeschooling families, supported charter schools, and fought to keep federal bureaucrats from dictating how we educate our kids. As governor, I'll make sure every Texas child has access to a quality education, regardless of their ZIP code. The audience applauded, but Greg wasn't finished. You know, Senator Davis, there's something else I want to address throughout this campaign. You've tried to make this about personalities and politics, but this isn't about us. It's about the future of Texas. It's about whether we're going to continue to lead the nation in job creation, in economic growth, and in defending our constitutional rights. Election night was never really in doubt. Greg won by the largest margin in Texas gubernatorial history, carrying to 154 out of 254 counties. As he addressed his victory celebration at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, he made a promise that would define his governorship tonight. Texas has chosen a new direction, he said, Cecilia beside him and thousands of supporters cheering. We've chosen to continue leading the nation in job creation, in economic opportunity, and in defending our constitutional rights. We've chosen to secure our border, to protect our Second Amendment, and to stand up for the values that make Texas the greatest state in America. Governor Greg Abbott's first day in office began at 4:30 a.m., just as it had every day for the past 30 years. But this morning, he wasn't just reviewing legal briefs or preparing for court arguments. This morning, he was preparing to lead the second largest state in America. His first cabinet meeting was held in the governor's conference room, a room that had hosted legendary Texas leaders like Sam Houston and Richards and George W. Bush. But the tone Greg set was distinctly his own. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, addressing his department heads, we're not here to manage government. We're here to lead Texas. Every decision we make, every policy we implement, has to pass one simple test. Does it make Texas stronger, freer, and more prosperous? His first major challenge came sooner than expected. The border crisis of 2014 had reached a breaking point, with thousands of unaccompanied minors crossing into Texas every day. Federal authorities seemed overwhelmed, and Texas communities were bearing the brunt of the crisis. Greg's response was swift and decisive. He deployed the Texas National Guard to the border and launched Operation Strong Safety, the largest border security operation in Texas history. The federal government has failed in its most basic duty, to secure our border, Greg told reporters at a press conference in McAllen. Texas won't wait for Washington to act. We're going to secure our border ourselves. The decision was controversial, with critics calling it political grandstanding, but the results spoke for themselves. Border crossings in the Rio Grande Valley decreased by 36% within 6 months. Miguel Ramirez, the sheriff of Hidalgo County, had been skeptical when Greg first announced the operation, but after seeing the results firsthand, he became one of the governor's strongest supporters. Governor Abbott didn't just talk about border security, Sheriff Ramirez said. He actually did something about it. My deputies finally had backup, and our communities were safer. Greg's second major challenge came from an unexpected source. The Texas legislature, some longtime legislators, accustomed to the more collaborative style of previous governors, were surprised by Greg's direct approach to leadership. During a heated meeting about education funding, State Representative Jim Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the legislature, challenged Greg's budget proposals. Governor, we've always done things a certain way in Texas, Morrison said. Maybe we should slow down and build more consensus. Greg's response was polite but firm. Representative Morrison, I respect your experience, but the people of Texas didn't elect me to do things the way they've always been done. They elected me to get results, and that's exactly what we're going to do. The exchange became legendary in Austin political circles. Greg wasn't interested in the traditional political games. He was focused on results. His education reforms were a perfect example. Instead of just increasing spending, Greg focused on accountability and choice. He signed legislation expanding charter schools, protecting homeschooling families, and giving parents more options for their children's education. At a school choice rally in Houston, Maria Santos, a single mother of 3, stood up to thank the governor. "Governor Abbott, before your reforms, my kids were stuck in a failing school because we couldn't afford to move to a better district," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Now my oldest daughter is in a charter school that's actually preparing her for college. You didn't just change our school system, you changed our family's future." But it was Greg's response to crisis that truly defined his leadership style. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey devastated the Texas Gulf Coast, causing unprecedented flooding and billions of dollars in damage. Greg's leadership during the crisis was masterful. He coordinated with federal agencies, deployed state resources, and personally visited affected communities. But it was a moment in a Houston shelter that showed his true character. 8-year-old Tommy Rodriguez had lost everything in the flood. His family's home was destroyed, and they were staying in a Red Cross shelter. When Governor Abbott visited the shelter, Tommy was sitting alone, clearly scared and confused. Greg rolled his wheelchair over to where Tommy was sitting. "Hey there, buddy," Greg said gently. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy replied quietly. "Well, Tommy, I'm Greg. I'm the governor of Texas, and I want you to know something. We're going to rebuild everything that was lost, and we're going to make it even better than it was before." Tommy looked up at Greg with wide eyes. Really, Greg promised. "And you know what? I know something about rebuilding. I've been doing it my whole life." The recovery from Hurricane Harvey was one of the most successful disaster responses in American history. Within 2 years, the affected areas had not only been rebuilt, but had come back stronger than ever. Greg's leadership during the crisis earned him praise from across the political spectrum. But for Greg, the real victory was in the lives that were rebuilt and the communities that were restored. Leadership isn't about managing from behind a desk, Greg would often say. It's about being where your people need you when they need you, and doing whatever it takes to solve their problems. By the end of his first term, Texas had become the undisputed leader in job creation, economic growth, and business relocation. Companies were fleeing high-tax, high-regulation states like California and New York and moving to Texas in record numbers. But Greg's greatest achievement wasn't measured in statistics or headlines. It was measured in the restored faith of millions of Texans who believed that their government was finally working for them. As Governor Abbott began his second term in 2019, Texas faced its greatest challenge yet, a global pandemic that would test every aspect of his leadership. The decisions he made during this crisis would define not just his governorship, but his legacy as one of Texas's most consequential leaders. The first cases of COVID-19 appeared in Texas in March 2020, while governors in other states were imposing strict lockdowns and shuttering businesses. Greg took a different approach, one that balanced public health with economic freedom and personal responsibility. Texans are smart enough to make their own decisions about their health and their families. Greg said during a press conference in Austin, "Government's job is to provide information and resources, not to micromanage people's lives." The decision was controversial, with critics predicting disaster. But Greg's faith in the Texas people proved justified. The state's economy recovered faster than almost any other state, while maintaining health outcomes that were comparable to states with much stricter lockdowns. Dr. Sarah Chen, an epidemiologist at a health science center, had initially been skeptical of Greg's approach, but as the data came in, she became one of his strongest supporters. Governor Abbott's strategy was brilliant, Dr. Chen said. He trusted people to make smart decisions, and they did. Texas proved that you don't have to choose between public health and economic freedom. You can have both. Greg's leadership during the pandemic wasn't just about policy. It was personal. He visited hospitals, talked to frontline workers, and made sure that Texas had the resources it needed to fight the virus. At a Houston hospital, he met with Dr. Maria Rodriguez, an ICU physician who had been working 18-hour days for months. "Governor, I want to thank you for not shutting down our economy," Dr. Rodriguez said. "My patients aren't just fighting COVID, they're fighting cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. When other states shut down, people couldn't get the care they needed. In Texas, we kept our hospitals open for everyone. But it was Greg's response to the 2021 winter storm that truly showcased his crisis leadership. When an unprecedented freeze knocked out power across Texas, leaving millions without heat or electricity, Greg coordinated the largest emergency response in state history. Working around the clock from the State Emergency Operations Center, Greg coordinated with utility companies, federal agencies, and local governments to restore power and save lives. This storm tested every system we have, Greg said during a press briefing. But it also showed the character of the Texas people, neighbors helping neighbors, communities coming together, and everyone working to solve the problem. The storm response wasn't perfect, no crisis response ever is. But Greg's leadership during those critical days prevented what could have been a much worse disaster. Jennifer Martinez, a nurse in Dallas, experienced the storm firsthand. Her apartment lost power for 3 days, but she continued working at the hospital to help patients. Governor Abbott didn't just coordinate the response, Jennifer said. He showed us what leadership looks like in a crisis. He was honest about the challenges. He worked around the clock to fix the problems. And he never stopped fighting for Texas families. As Greg's second term progressed, his national profile continued to grow. He was mentioned as a potential presidential candidate, and his opinions on national issues carried weight far beyond Texas borders. But Greg remained focused on Texas. He signed legislation protecting religious freedom, defending the Second Amendment, and securing the border. He cut taxes, reduced regulations, and made Texas the most business-friendly state in America. The results spoke for themselves. Texas continued to lead the nation in job creation, business relocations, and economic growth. The state's population grew by 4 million people during Greg's tenure, with families and businesses fleeing high tax, high regulation states for the freedom and opportunity that Texas offered. At a celebration marking his 10th year as governor, Greg reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 38 years ago, I was lying under a tree, wondering if my life was over. He told the crowd of supporters, "Today, I can say with certainty that it was just the beginning. That accident didn't define me, it refined me, it taught me that true strength comes not from what happens to you, but from how you respond to what happens to you." The crowd erupted in applause. But Greg wasn't finished. Texas has always been about second chances, about turning challenges into opportunities, about never giving up on the American dream. That's what the state gave me, and that's what I've tried to give back every single day as your governor. As he looked out at the crowd, ranchers from West Texas, teachers from Houston, small business owners from the Rio Grande Valley, tech workers from Austin, Greg saw the face of Texas, diverse, resilient, and united by shared values of freedom, opportunity, and personal responsibility. The story of Texas isn't just about oil wells and cattle ranches, Greg continued. It's about people who refuse to accept limitations, who turn obstacles into stepping stones, and who never stop believing that tomorrow can be better than today. Greg Abbott's story, from that hospital bed in 1984 to the governor's mansion in 2023, embodied everything that made Texas special. It was a story of resilience, determination, and unwavering principle. It was a story that inspired millions of Texans to believe that no challenge was too great, no obstacle too large, and no dream too ambitious. As he concluded his speech that night, Greg made a promise that captured the essence of his leadership and his love for Texas. "As long as I'm your governor, Texas will never stop leading, never stop fighting, and never stop being the greatest state and the greatest nation on earth. And when my time is done, I hope I'll be remembered not for the challenges I faced, but for the opportunities I helped create for future generations of Texans." The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes, but for Greg Abbott, the real applause came from knowing that Texas was stronger, freer, and more prosperous than ever before, and that the best was yet to come.